because we cover so many of the pieces that I can never learn on my own. Because with my law and policy focus, it's more big picture. And so a lot of times I don't really, until I hear it here, I don't really understand the importance of something. And so last year, the thing that came to me like over and over and over was 5G. And I had, before attending this conference, thought about 5G as being something that, made streaming faster on my phone. But listening to y'all, what I determined was it really is an important infrastructure, especially for artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things. So I wound up publishing 2 papers on this, one really focusing on data law and its impact on China, Europe, and the United States, because they all have very different ways of looking at what you can do with data, but also on government policy when it came to 5G, because that's making a huge difference. The paper I'm going to talk about today, I call it The Innovation Winter is Coming, which is a little bit of a negative slant, but the US-China trade war is going to have a big impact on how 5G is rolled out throughout the world. So I want to touch on some of the things that have happened, why they've happened, and what my predictions are. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, we're talking big picture. So with artificial intelligence, it's really this idea of machines that can do things such as make decisions. But where it really comes into focus is in the Internet of Things, which we kind of, from hearing from many of the people even today, it takes an installed infrastructure for this data to move around. And if we have the 5G infrastructure, what we're able to do is we're able to move data more quickly and with lower latency. So we've had what we would characterize as an AI spring, meaning we've had all these developments that came with 4G. And we have big data. We didn't have big data before because we didn't have these, what I like to call, mobile surveillance devices that we all carry with us all the time. And they're really tracking everything we do. They're tracking our location, they're tracking what we search, they're tracking our communications. And this data, we don't really think about what happens to it or where it goes, but it's being used by companies to make predictions. And it's not just for targeting advertising. It's for these companies' future. A lot of that data gets repackaged and sold onwards. It's an enormous industry in the United States. We also have increased storage. So as we discussed Moore's Law a few times, where the chips keep getting smaller and more data is being able to be stored. But one of the biggest things that has impacted this is cloud computing. So what we have now are these off-site servers that a small company would never be able to afford the type of server that they need to do the advanced processing you need for artificial intelligence or the Internet of Things. Now they can just rent space from Amazon. And not only that, not only just the storage, but it's the increased processing capability. So Amazon will actually provide processing of data, not just the storage. And then, of course, speed. And speed really comes down. Again, many speakers spoke about this today when we're talking about 5G and the different bandwidths. We do not have that speed currently with 4G. So the potential for the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence is just, it's incredible. So we're using artificial intelligence currently to detect pathologies more quickly and more accurately than humans can do. We also are aiding in disaster relief because we have people with phones in disasters that can give you real-time information that we were unable to track or get before. We have the future with smart cities, factories, and homes, and of course, down the road, self-driving cars. So artificial intelligence, this is my little formula, artificial intelligence plus 5G is Internet of Things. And we have this potential, but I think in much of the research and a lot of the policy, especially in the United States, we really haven't focused on this missing piece, which is the speed and reduced latency. So the speed comes from the 5G. The reduced latency comes from edge computing. So with the edge computing, what you have is processing closer to the source. So whereas you had the cloud computing before, if you kind of envision it, you're seeing data move to an off-site server and back to make a decision or a prediction. By putting edge computing either with the small base stations or else with the device itself, or in the car, for example, what you're doing is you're having near instantaneous decisions. So what the future of innovation requires is this infrastructure. And my research has led me to believe that there's a number of reasons why this is all at risk, one of which is what I call a failure of policy on the part of the United States in really understanding 5G, the need for 5G, as well as not really understanding what's needed to facilitate the development of artificial intelligence. So one of the things we've done, and this paper came out of my big paper, because as I got into it more, I realized this was a way more important piece than what I had originally discussed, which were law and policy in the different countries. The US government is moving away from globalization. And in doing so, we hear a lot of rhetoric about what that means, America first, protecting our companies. But what's happening is actually the opposite. We're actually causing harm to our companies. So we also have this instigation of a trade war with China, which I'll discuss some of the reasons for that. And then the real problem is this complete failure of policy when it comes to 5G and the Internet of Things. So after World War II, the United States took a major role in globalization. The idea behind globalization is that if you get all the countries to trade with one another, it's more likely to keep the peace. So this interdependence was desirable, and this interdependence was actually promoted by the United States. But what happened is we had a number of things that go on between World War II and today. We had, in 1978, China opened its doors. Prior to that, China was very much insular. They did not allow trading with other people, and they began to have this trading, but they also began to allow privatization of industry. And what the privatization of industry did was it created a middle class in China with money to buy American goods. So not only do we see this increase in the US buying from China, but we have an increase with China buying from the US. And we often ignore that when you read about things today. We don't realize that it goes both ways. Now, with the US moving away from globalization, what it's done, and this is one of these, I call it the law of unintended consequences. What it's done is it's created this huge gap in leadership in the world. And this gap is being filled by China. And I want to talk a little bit about that because as the US becomes more insular and endorses these protectionist activities, we're leaving a lot of countries out there. And in fact, we're actually alienating a lot of our former allies. Now, we have a big difference in policy when it comes to, and in this talk, I'm just going to talk about the US and China with just a couple mentions of Europe, just for time limitations. But in the US, what we've seen is a decrease in science funding every single year since the late 1960s. Once the space program was over, we said, you know what? We're going to leave it all to private industry to move technology forward. We've just kind of felt that the government doesn't have a role in science or technology or innovation. As you probably notice, I always refer back to the, to the Cambridge Analytica hearings in the Senate. Congress has no clue about technology. They did not know how Facebook made money. We have an executive branch, for the most part, many agencies that don't understand technology. We have this really underfunded artificial intelligence policy. So in 2019, President Trump created the AI initiative, and a lot of people were pretty excited about that. They said, you know what, we're gonna get on board. Well, two problems. First, it's a little bit too late. This should have been done about 10 years ago. But also, this policy provides no new funding to the sciences or for the development of artificial intelligence. What it does is it basically tells all the administrative agencies, all right, here's what I want you to do. I want you to reallocate your budgets to include more artificial intelligence, which really does not much for the private sector. So China, on the other hand, has had this long-term goal that they've been working on. And one of the advantages to the type of government that China has is that it's centralized. Its government says what the companies are going to do. And you know, for most of us in the United States, we feel like, ooh, this is terrible. Companies should just do what they want. But when it's put with this type of strategy with very specific goals, what they've done is they've become very effective in their development of artificial intelligence. So the government supports their tech industry. So we call this, the United States, we look at China and we say, well, they're unfairly subsidizing industry. Yeah, they are. They're providing money for developments in technology that we, private companies, pay for here to develop. We don't have the government funding for that. They support emerging economies through building infrastructure. And I'll talk about this a little more specifically, but this is huge. You've probably heard about the digital Silk Road, maybe? What this essentially is China said, you know what? We have the networking equipment. We have the technology. We have the know-how. You know what we need? We need some more trading partners. And we're no longer an emerging technology. An emerging economy. We want to go into emerging economies. So what they're doing is they're helping other countries, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia, build their not only transportation infrastructure, but their communication infrastructure. And this is something the US has completely stepped away from. We are providing less support to other countries. So every time the US takes a step back, China takes a step forward. Now, one of the things is, one of the impacts of this, again, I call it the law of unintended consequences, is China is going to be able to put their equipment in these countries. And my guess, or my prediction is, a lot of those agreements that start installing this infrastructure will be exclusivity agreements, meaning they'll essentially lock US companies out. So even if we're able to develop the ability to create the hardware needed for 5G infrastructure, we're going to be locked out of markets. So the three main initiatives that China has, I'll talk about them in order. The first is the Belts and Roads Initiative. This goes to the digital Silk Road. And the idea is China wants to increase its exports, especially in the area of technology and networking equipment. So they've targeted 64 countries, and they've been pretty effective in getting in the door. A lot of the news really focuses on Europe. I don't know if you noticed that. And the US has basically threatened European countries that if they do use Huawei or ZTE to install their infrastructure, we're no longer going to share intelligence. The problem, of course, is that Europe is pretty much full of Chinese equipment. It's a lot cheaper than Nokia and Ericsson. It's 30 to 40% cheaper, and it's already embedded. And these components are not interchangeable. You can't just say, well, okay, we're not going to put any more Chinese equipment in. We're going to use other equipment. It's estimated that if Europe were to do that, it would slow down the installation of its 5G infrastructure for about 5 years. And of course, we have this framing of a race, like everybody's trying to get their 5G infrastructure installed. It's not really a race. We are not dealing with the problem, which is this lack of uniform standards and this lack of cooperation, especially when it comes to China and the US. So Made in China 2025, this was a goal to move away from being, they had a reputation of being like a copycat manufacturer, so making goods that may violate companies' trademark laws, to becoming a tech innovator. And the government has just thrown a ton of money behind this project, not only supporting Chinese companies, but actually providing money to Silicon Valley companies. And we demonize this, but the United States does this as well. If you don't have the level of technology you need in a certain area, you buy a company that has it. China buys companies that have it. They support startups that are working in artificial intelligence and Internet of Things. I'll talk about how the US has slowed that down, but this is a very common way for countries to develop quickly when they don't have the ramp-up time to get to the level they need to be. One of the things that I think is that people don't understand about China is they adopt technology very quickly, a lot more quickly than we do in the US. And I always think about this when I first started teaching to Masters of Accounting students. One of the topics I had to teach was commercial paper. And with commercial paper, I would say, I'd pull out the checkbook, my checkbook, and say, so when you're writing a check, and none of the students in my class had ever had a checkbook. They had no clue what I was referring to. They didn't write checks. Well, in China, there's young adults that have never had a credit card. They've never used a credit card. They don't know what it is. It seems weird. They use their phones to pay for everything. But that's how quickly they adopt things, and we are nowhere near that level. But what it does is it gives an incredibly eager local market to purchase these tech innovations in a way that we don't have here. Now, the third leg of this whole strategy that China is using is called the Next Generation AI Development Plan. And what China wants to do is they want to be a leader in artificial intelligence. And it kind of goes hand in hand with these other two strategies that they're using to essentially work up this industry where they are the ones that are the global leader. And I'll come back to this, it's been mentioned a couple times already, but they want to set global standards, not just for 5G, but for artificial intelligence, including the ethics of artificial intelligence. And if you think about what that means, China has very different values than the US does. Our Western values, we value privacy. Eastern values don't value privacy as much. They value community. It's a different way of looking at the world. They don't have the same problems or same gut reaction that we do to surveillance, for example. When we think about government surveillance, we get upset. In China, that's not that big of a deal. They feel it keeps them safer. So when you think about China being able to set the standards for the world, it raises a lot of issues. So the US moves towards protectionism. We start repudiating open trade. But one of the things that we've done, they're little pieces, but they all fall into this category. We have refused to appoint members to the appellate court of the World Trade Organization, which means it's effectively not functioning. The World Trade Organization was founded after World War II primarily by the United States. We are now refusing to participate in it. We've also indicated that we're not really bound by their rules. And if you think about what a big paradigm shift that is, again, law of unintended consequences. China has a problem, they go to the World Trade Organization. They're actually the ones that are using this mechanism that was developed by the United States to get their disputes resolved, and the US is refusing to participate. We have instituted sanctions. We keep calling them tariffs. They're not tariffs, they're trade sanctions. We've instituted them not just against China, but against countries in Europe, Canada, and Mexico, and Latin America. We are trying to do something without really thinking about the global effect. So my thesis is the reason behind all this is not the stated reasons, forced technology transfers and all of these things that China has been doing that we need to punish them for. It's more that we woke up and we said, whoa, we have really dropped the ball here on AI, 5G, technology policy, technology law. And what we're doing is we're trying to slow down China's growth. We don't want China to make standards for the world. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, we're about 10 years too late. To get up to speed right now is going to take, we're going to have a ramp-up period. And I think that's going to be very difficult to do. One of the interesting reports that I read, and this came out 2018, end of 2018, it was from the Pentagon. And they said that they concluded pretty much the same thing that I've just told you, that the US is behind the times. Chinese equipment is much less expensive than that which can be obtained from Europe. It's of superior quality and functionality. A big issue is this lack of interoperability. So even if we started developing our own industry where we can make components to contribute to the infrastructure, they're not going to work with Chinese components. And then a big issue, we saw a little bit of it with our speaker, David, I think his name was yesterday, in the Hill Country, is the rural United States. In the rural United States, we do have very lax, we don't pay a lot of attention to the infrastructure, but a great deal of that infrastructure, because we're talking very small telecom companies, is built with Chinese products. And the United States government has said, we're going to provide $9 billion to build out broadband and internet access to all the rural parts of America. But what you don't hear is they said, yeah, but we're going to condition that money on you ripping out all the Chinese equipment. Well, that causes a big problem, because if you're ripping out equipment before you have new equipment in place, you don't have service. So I think this is one of those areas where we're going to have to come up with some kind of better solution. So we have a lack of US strategy. We have China being the primary supplier of 5G networking equipment. And when I say equipment, I'm talking about the hardware. We have two companies that really could have been very instrumental in the advancement of the United States in this area. Lucent and Motorola, which we both sold to European companies. So we don't even produce the equipment. The closest one that we have is Intel. And they produce such a small percentage of the global supply of the hardware that it's almost not worth mentioning. We just don't have it here. What we do have, and what has been harmful to China, is we have the chips. We have the chip makers. But what it has done is by telling China, we're not going to sell you chips anymore, China has ramped up its development of artificial intelligence chips. Every time we try to cut them off, they adapt. So it's harming the chip makers here in the US who now don't have that market to sell to. We also have a number of executive orders. We have, in May, US companies banned from using Chinese telecom equipment, Huawei being placed on the banned entities list. China, they issued the white paper denouncing these protectionist measures and actually take it to the World Trade Organization. And then we have this kind of rationale for everything we're doing as we're going to increase US jobs, we are going to stop the Chinese from spying with their equipment, we're going to prevent them from taking our technology. But again, all of these excuses are really not the reason for the position we're in today. Now we had and you've probably heard of this, the Foreign Risk Review Modernization Act. Granted, it was old and it did need to be updated, but much of our laws relating to technology are very old. But keep in mind, China invested $3 billion in Silicon Valley startups. And that money has been lost. Without them being able to invest in these startups are scrambling for money in the US. China was easy because China said, hey, we'll give you money, you share what you develop with us. And that worked because we have this. Another thing that people forget about is most of the coding that goes into artificial intelligence that's developed in the US is open source. It means it's online. Any of us can go on there and we can further develop artificial intelligence, including other countries. So we don't even keep our artificial intelligence source code private. One thing that is really affecting, especially the Seattle area and San Francisco area, are these H1B restrictions. So we are restricting people from other countries, especially China, from coming over. We're also have a huge reduction in spousal visas. So even if we do find people we want to come over, they can't bring their wife or their husband. And this has really harmed the industry because we need these people with advanced degrees in technology that we're just not producing here in the US. They produce these people in India, in China, and now what's happening is students who are seeking the PhDs are going to Canada or England. So not only are we losing students, we're losing these workers with these advanced degrees. So the trade war is really harming a number of areas. It's harming the economy, it's harming democracy, and it's harming AI innovation. So our exports have declined since the beginning of the trade war. US tech companies are losing market value because they no longer have this willing buyer, the companies in China. We have a number of costs to consumers as a result of these tariffs. And we have, Europe is suffering as well. Europe is kind of stuck in the middle. They want to be friends with both. They have a vested interest in maintaining a relationship with China because so much of their 3G and 4G infrastructure is made with Chinese components. But they also don't want to alienate the United States because the United States provides a lot of support to Europe. With democracy, this is kind of a touchy issue. But we are no longer using the international trade mechanisms that we actually helped create to resolve these disputes. And what we're having now is kind of like a tit-for-tat tariff war, which is, it's not helping China or the US. And because the US is moving away as a global leader, it's leaving this huge gap that China is filling. And the concern is, for example, China has a government focus, but this kind of government, I don't want to call it control, but they they're really able to draw a circle around their internet. This type of model is now being used in Vietnam and Thailand. And those are smaller countries, so it's a lot easier. But personally, I don't think this is a model that we want replicated throughout the world, but I think that's the way we're going. Something that's really interesting is that China has already established a center in Brussels to work on 5G standardization. And I remember one of the speakers yesterday was speaking about how the US wants involvement with that. The US doesn't have a dog in the fight. I mean, the US doesn't have anything to contribute. Europe is working with China on this. China has also forged a partnership with Russia on this. So those standards are going to come from that side of the world. They're not going to come from us. So the innovation winter is really the kind of gist of this entire paper. And that is, because we have this lack of cooperation and we have this movement away from sharing technology, trading with one another, agreeing on standards, my guess is we're going to see a decrease in innovation. One of the impacts will be the slower development of the 5G infrastructure in the United States. If you need the 5G infrastructure in order to advance the Internet of Things, for example, the smart factories, the vehicle-to-vehicle communications, and we can only install it incrementally, it's going to take so many years before it's up that these types of technologies can't develop until it's already there. China is way ahead of us in terms of their country in installing it. And they're also really working hard on getting it installed in these emerging markets, especially Africa. And so my prediction there is we're going to see Africa having a lot of opportunity to make technological advances with the help of China that the US won't even be able to do because we're going to lack the infrastructure. Without providing funding to US companies for the development, we're also going to see the continued commercialization of AI. AI has a lot of positive uses that could be used for social good. You know, detecting disease clusters, cancer clusters, environmental issues. But this is not something that companies are incentivized to research or provide. These are the types of research activities that academics get into. And when you keep reducing the funding for this every year, we're not going to see that track of development. The biggest risk, of course, and somebody touched on this just a little bit, is this bifurcation of the internet. Russia is already experimenting with closing up their internet, similar to the way that China does. It's very possible that the US will be left out if it turns out that Africa also draws a circle around their internet and Southeast Asia draws a circle around their internet. The US is going to be kept out of being able to not only provide technology and infrastructure for those markets, but to sell to those markets. So I think the trade war is one of those things where we look at it, you know, from a very upper surface level. I don't think we really see the long-term impact that this could have on the world. So the US really can't afford to do this, and things have to change. In terms of what I recommend, you know, somebody said it yesterday, we keep throwing money at the problem. I think we need to throw money at the problem, but in a much smarter way than what we're doing. We can't just tell tech companies, you know, you guys need to fix this all. It's really too late for that. The US government has to establish 5G and AI policy. You know, one of the things that the speakers mentioned yesterday was this difference in spectrum bands. Europe and China, and now Africa and Southeast Asia, are all signed up, all going to use the mid-range bands. The US, in its initial auctions, was only auctioned off the low-range waves and the millimeter waves. Again, that will make those components non-interchangeable with the majority of the world. So we really need to get on top of this. We need to start establishing policy that actually makes sense. And instead of trying to punish another country, figure out how we can advance the US technological industry. And any questions? Too frightening? Yes.
For the thing I said yesterday, check into Web 3.0. I know the current open source, I think, is either in Germany and maybe English.
Yeah, that's in my paper.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and the other one was, have you factored in, because one of the things about American private enterprise is that it's very, very closed inside the corporation. So how much have you factored in, like, for example, I think it's Google or Amazon, whatever, takes half of the graduating data scientists from the University of Washington, and it's because they have a pipe to the prof, get the best, and then the left, I guess, could be left for China even. But the fact that we have people commercializing at the cloud level AI, as AI processors, in the cloud, I expect that we will start to see the offer of their people for our corporations, because the real driver is I think, going to be the corporation.
Well, it is corporations. My concern, though, is, again, it's trending down a very commercial track, and I would like to see more artificial intelligence developed for social good.
Actually, there's some neat artificial intelligence stuff. Yeah, actually, there's some neat artificial intelligence stuff being to run the cloud, because you can't, it's going too fast.
Right.
And a lot of the data you need is very detailed.
And when do you delete that data? That's another issue, is storage, future storage.
Have you looked into the money side of things? So let me use Germany as an example.
In terms of why Germany is...
Exactly,
Yeah.
because of the cars, right? I mean,
Right.
They sell cars to China, and that's the
Yep,
quid pro quo, right?
exactly. And I think we're going to see a lot of that with Europe, even though they're kind of keeping it on the down low, because, again, they don't want to alienate the United States. But they have such close ties with Chinese companies that it's really hard to, disengage them.
I'm curious about that. We've talked a lot about this, that middle spectrum.
Yeah.
What is it being used for in the U.S., and what sort of market forces are sort
military.
of?
Oh,
okay.
it's reserved for, a lot of it's reserved for military, and they're not willing to give up any part of it.
So there's no market there for the people who own it to sell it to this
Right.
higher value.
No secondary market until the U.S. says, you know what, you can work in this band.
Everything you said is all of the things that are visible. Here's what the legal, legitimate areas are. Let's go underneath, look at the dark side. Have you had a chance to look at the issue of all of the criminal areas ranging from cybercrime, copyright, patent violations, et cetera?
Yes, the whole middle of my paper addresses the 4 major complaints about China. My conclusion is the U.S. does all the same exact things. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying we should allow this or promote this, but it's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black.
One last thing that we have to move on. I think a lot of folks around the world see the domination of Microsoft and Google and Apple, et cetera, as being the U.S. being the real hegemon here.
Right.
Do you see that perhaps changing as China dominates more of the global infrastructure and their versions of those companies maybe dominate?
I'm actually, February 5th, I'm actually speaking to the European Parliament about they invited me to speak about artificial intelligence, because one of the concerns is that the European tech industry has never taken off. And it's because of their data laws. They're so restricted on what they can do with data. And they're really interested in, so what can we do about this? Well, when you have these ties with China and Europe, what you're going to see is the US kind of being shut out. Now, Europe does not have the same, Alibaba, Tencent, WeChat, and Baidu. The US has those exact companies except in Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple. Europe is really interested in developing these, but I don't have an answer, but I'm wondering, is US influence in these areas going to move in, or is Chinese influence going to move in? Because China is very interested in getting that business there.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kimberly.
Thank you.